Alright, welcome to Peeling Syd Barrett. This will be episode 15. And in this episode, I'd like to run through the song Chapter 24. So before we get into that, or you can go ahead and check it out now if you want, I'll give a link for a lyric video for Chapter 24. And I'll give some information here on the screen. And I'll link it as well in the description. So if you want to go check out Chapter 24 and come back, you can. I'm going to run through corrections real quick, though, or notes and corrections, I guess I should say. So one of the things that we discussed in the last episode was the nature of perhaps a strained relation between Mr. Barrett and David Bowie, or the appearance of it. So one thing that I think is possible, now we did kind of mention that there may have been some, because of the scarlet clothing being worn by the gnome, and also the drinking of wine, and just the very topic of singing about a gnome specifically. I mean, fairies, that you could sing about, including like leprechauns and stuff. So perhaps that was something that upset Mr. Barrett. But something that I didn't discuss, which is possible, is just the tone of the song. So the tone of the David Bowie song for the Laughing Gnome, it falls into that, I guess you could call it almost like a skeptical form of thought for the history of these things. And it rings a little bit of dismissiveness. So Mr. Barrett's song is not dismissive at all. It actually is. It's of course a fantastic setting, but it also is a setting that relays some respect in its delivery. So perhaps Mr. Barrett was upset with the nature of the delivery, because for some people, the idea of little people and fairies and stuff, it's a serious topic. It's not something to just be kind of thrown away. So and one reason that I say that is, as we've discussed before, Mr. Andrew Lang is someone who did a lot of fairy stories, and I suspect that Mr. Barrett did read some of Mr. Andrew Lang's work, and I'll get into that a little bit later when we do a final on Jug Band Blues. But just for now, I would like to point out that Mr. Lang did do beyond that, and that's a lot of writing. Trust me, the fairy books by Mr. Andrew Lang, which are organized by color, so there's like yellow, red, green fairy book, etc. He also did a book that's called The Secret Commonwealth of Elves, Fauns, and Fairies, a study in folklore and psychical research. I don't know about the psychical research aspect of it. I don't know totally what all was what I guess you would call scientifically researched, but as far as I know, this book is not copyrighted. I mean, it's a pretty old book, but let's run through a number of things. Now, Mr. Lang apparently did believe, or at least try to understand, the serious background of the history of these people. And I would just like to point out that Mr. Barrett, as we've discussed, is heavily influenced by literature, and we have to recognize the history of Irish literature, or the contributions of Irish writers to English literature, and it is quite profound. So the history of Irish fairy tale, folk, and legends is something that very likely Mr. Barrett took quite seriously, and even though he may not specifically have been someone that totally believed in it, he would have still respected it, and so that may be a contributor to the idea that perhaps he didn't like the tone of Mr. Bowie's song. Now, within this book, and I'm not going to read a whole lot of it, but there's a discussion on the history of subterranean inhabitants, There's a discussion on the history of fairyland and Hades. Um, there's a little bit of history about the fairies themselves, and within the book on page 25, Mr. Lang specifically calls out the fairies as people of peace. They do make trouble, but they don't really go around just kind of murdering people and trying to kill them. As a general rule, perhaps if someone was really nasty to them, they might do something really nasty. But as a general rule, these people are kind of, or these people of peace are kind of, I guess you could say, they're not too appreciative of people that don't respect them and show respect to the things that belong to them, or the places that they live. And you can point to a lot of stories about that. There also is a preamble and an essay on the nature of certain people having what Mr. Lang calls second sight. And second sight basically is humans that are either gifted with, or eventually, due to some reason, develop a second sight, an ability to see things that other people can't see, which includes things like elves, fauns, fairies, and the like. And the last thing that I'd kind of like to point out is that Mr. Lang also points out on like page 71 that the Sith pronunciation varies for fairy people. Some people pronounce it she. So the she, or people at rest and respect of us in peace, some people will develop second sight not long before they expire or die. So it's perhaps it's a discussion about people having access to greater visual capacity, or perhaps just hallucinating. And I saw a kind of a TED talk about people, I believe it was about people dreaming more vividly or hallucinating not long before death. And here it is. I mean, he's discussing the idea of people hallucinating or actually developing second sight, depending upon your viewpoint. I'm not going to say one's right and one's wrong. I don't know. But that happening not long before someone's going to move on to whatever second world they may be, or perhaps just that's a part of decay. I don't know. So, I guess that's pretty much it. I guess if you're really into this type of topic, the last thing I guess that I'll note is towards the end there is a note where Mr. Lang mentions that fairy talk is kind of like they have a speech that sounds a lot like whistling. So in Homer, he relates that that spirits twitter like bats. I don't know if you've ever heard a bat make noise, but it's kind of a high piercing kind of a shriek, like a chittering noise. And also feeble squeaks, although they differentiate between that and the noise of rats, though, I mean, that's what comes to my mind is the noise of rats. That's pretty much it for that. So let's go ahead then and go ahead and get into this particular episode, which will be about chapter 24. Before I move on, I would like to mention one last item that isn't really related, but there is a poet named Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and she wrote quite a few well-respected poems, I guess you could say, and the name Barrett, of course, is there, so it does make me wonder if, as a young man, did Mr. Barrett see that someone with the same last name was a avid writer of poetry? Did that kind of inspire him to be involved with poetry? I'm not entirely certain, but I'll give some information about the poems that she wrote, and I guess one of the most famous ones that she did was the poem How Do I Love Thee? Let Me Count the Ways. And she has a number of very good poems, so I don't know if there's any relation there or not, but that is certainly something of note to me, that perhaps he may have seen that there was someone with the same name that was into poetry. So let's go ahead and move on to the song itself. So hopefully you've had time to kind of check out chapter 24. And for Syd Barrett and Pink Floyd fans, this song, if you are of a certain mindset, is an incredibly important song. And it's difficult really to explain why, but this may be the most important song in the entire album of The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, if you want to have an explanation of what happened with Mr. Barrett. Now, we've already kind of discussed that there may have been some kind of internal conflicts going on with previous songs, and this particular song may give us some resolution as to what the resolution Mr. Barrett had was. Let's go ahead and discuss the song, Chapter 24, by Mr. Barrett. And for people that are interested in the history of Pink Floyd and Mr. Barrett, and perhaps want to come to some kind of understanding of why or what his thought process may have been when he left the band, and an explanation as to perhaps where he thought he would be going, this song is probably the most important song off of the entire album. So this is chapter 24 from the I Ching, and there are various translations of it. This is a form of a book of a nonfiction, I suppose you could say, and I have read through it to some degree, and I have tried to understand what in particular may be directly translated. Now, when I look through the lyrics, I can't find a direct translation with what Mr. Barrett has for his lyrics. But let's go ahead and look at his lyrics, and I suspect he is doing more than one thing with his lyrics. I think he's quoting from the I Ching, he's mixing in his own story, and perhaps he's trying to write a song and deliver a message through that song at the same time. So he relays in the first line the idea of there being 6 stages, and the 7th is completion. Now, for anyone who is versed in Judeo-Christian Bible study, they'll recognize the number 7 as a cycle, a full cycle, and that reference, of course, is it's also here in the I Ching, and we'll see that in a minute. 7 is tied to the idea of a beginning light, and comes from darkness being increased. Now, that reminds me of the idea within the Kabbalah of, and I don't go into a lot of that, but there's a lot of different ideas here, and I'm sure there's a lot of people with different opinions, but there is a compounding kind of a emptiness idea within the Kabbalah of the Ein and the Ein Sofer. So, and I'm not an expert on this, so please don't think that I'm any form of, I guess you could say, a doctored scholar on these topics. But if you want to study Kabbalah, you can. The idea of increasing darkness or increasing outworldiness, otherness, is contained in the creation of the structure of the tree of life within Kabbalah, or the background behind it. He mentions that there are changes, and there are returns, and there are success in that line, and going and coming. So comings and goings, and that's acceptable. And action bringing good fortune, and sunset. Now, a sunset is an end to something. For people symbolically, a sunset obviously represents the end of a day, but it also represents the end of pretty much anything. The sunset of our lives, the sunset of our prime, the sunset of anything means the end of a specific cycle, which is, of course, mentioned previously. Now, I just want to re-emphasize the idea of there being mention of change, returning, success, going and coming, and not having errors, and then this action is going to bring good fortune. Next, after that, he mentions that the timing of this will be at the winter solstice, which is, of course, late December, mid to late December. And that's of interest because around the end of December is the time when the band and Mr. Barrett kind of decided that they were done. And although he did help with the next album on a few songs, he wasn't really around and contributing to that. The only song that he contributed was Jug Band Blues, which I believe was recorded in December of '67. So let's just look at a few things here real quick. Now, we know that in that statement, he's discussing the idea of an end of things with the sunset, the time being winter solstice, which is in December, which is when around the time that he left the band. He discusses going and coming, so going is leaving and coming, and not having problems, and that change will bring success. So you really have to wonder if in this song he's not relaying the idea that he is planning to leave. And what is the exact extent of that? Now, he mentions coming and going, so perhaps he's talking about returning over time. There are quite a few people, and as we mentioned before, I believe it was an interview with David Gilmour, and he relays the idea that that we had on that previous link for that interview with Mr. Gilmour, that perhaps Mr. Barrett would stay on as a writer of some sort for the band and wouldn't really travel with them and play with them anymore, but he would help write music for them. Although over some time they abandoned that idea. How long that period of time was, there's no way of knowing. And did he actually write music for them? There's no way of knowing. Of course, there are only like 3 or 4 more songs that he's actually credited with writing, like Vegetable Man, Apples and Oranges, and Jug Band Blues, and Scream Thy Last Scream, which wasn't released. Supposedly there's more material that was never released, but most of the songs the band didn't really like or didn't want to put out because they didn't think that they were acceptable songs. So if Mr. Barrett chose to leave, which this song seems to be relaying, and his thought process was that he would come and go as he pleased, kind of, and he would perhaps be working as a songwriter to some degree. Who knows what his mindset is, but it's kind of here in this song. You can see the lyrics seem to be pointing to the idea of that. Now, if you believe that this is directly taken from the I Ching, I will say to you that not to my knowledge. And I'm going to go through the I Ching here in just a minute. When I'm done, we'll do chapter 24, which you could read as being simply figure 24 of the I Ching. So the next group of lyrics is that we discussed the winter solstice and the change is due to come. There's thunder, and nothing is destroyed once and for all. And then change will be back with success. He mentions the same thing again, going and coming. Sunset, and then sunrise this time. So sunset and then sunrise, which means the beginning of something entirely new. And then he goes back to the beginning where he discusses the idea of 6 stages and 7th stage having returned, and etc., etc. So I'll repeat from that point in time. Now, we've discussed to some degree the idea that a lot of people have that this may be taken directly from the I Ching. Now, if you're not familiar with the I Ching, I'll give you a few principles of it really quickly. So basically, it has to do with, and you could do this on your own if you want, if you're into this kind of thing. It's a lot, in my opinion, it's a lot like tarot cards. Basically, you're establishing patterns, and then they're supposed to relay some form of personal message, perhaps, that you can deconstruct and consider as a form of philosophical or a life contemplation. But basically, if you have 3 coins, what you do is you just take those 3 coins and you flip them, and then you count them up. And a head is worth 3 points, and a tail is worth 2 points. So your possible combinations are 2-2-2, which would be 6, or 2-2-3, which would be 7, or 2-3-3, which would be 8, or 3-3-3, which would be 9. Those are your possible valuations: 6, 7, 8, 9. And each one of those corresponds with an open or a closed line. So the number 9 is a closed line, and there's a little bit more to it than this. I'm just kind of throwing it at you real quick. The number 6 is a broken line. The number 7 is a solid line, and the number 8 is a broken line. And you build from the bottom up. So you stack these lines on top of each other, and when you've thrown your 3 coins 6 times, you'll have 6 lines. Those, if you do, there's 2 possibilities for each line. It's either solid or broken. So that's 2 possibilities by 6, or 2 to the 6th power, which gives you the number 64, and that is how many hexagrams you have, possibly, for the I Ching. Now, each one of these symbols or hexagrams has a meaning to it that's tied a bit to its shape, and I'm sure there's some other kind of cultural background going on that I'm not familiar with. But let's look at the hexagram for chapter 24, or the Fu hexagram. And basically it's a solid line on the base with all 5 lines above it being broken or split into 2. And if you look at that just by nature, that looks like a solid base with 2 columns that are not supported. They're just 2 opposing columns. And that is, to some degree, very unstable. And we'll see in a minute why Mr. Barrett may have been interested in figure 24, hexagram 24, or the Fu hexagram. So when I look through this now, this book mentions that Fu indicates that there's going to be a freedom in course and in progress of things, which makes sense because the top of it, you read it from the base up, is free. It's a free top. There won't be anyone to bother a person in their exits and entrances. So there's the relation back to coming and going. Friends will come to him. There's no errors. And then he'll be able to repeat their proper course, and then 7 days will be a return. And there will be advantages in whatever direction that people want to move. So I'd just like to point out that the 7 days thing is not known, and it's basically relaying a period of time. So the reason that is interesting or important, it's actually very important to people that are into this kind of thing, is because the days just represent 7 cycles. So it could be weeks, months, or years. And it is almost exactly 7 years to the date that Mr. Barrett returns to the band at the Wish You Were Here recordings. And those recordings are in January through July of 1975. So Mr. Barrett leaves in late 67 or very early 68, and in early 75 he returns during the Wish You Were Here album recording. And people say it just kind of comes out of the blue and everything else, but I will point to you and say it is possible that he was specifically saying he planned on doing that here in this song. So let's run through the lines really quick. The first line, which is undivided, shows a person returning that doesn't require any form of repentance, and there's good luck. The second one, which is divided, shows the admirable return and good luck. The third one shows the person has made repeated returns, although that is a little bit dangerous. There won't be any mistakes. The fourth line, which is again broken, shows the person moving right I don't know exactly what that means. And then returning alone. And of course, Mr. Barrett did return alone. The fifth line shows return of the subject and no need for repentance, whatever that means. And then the last line, the sixth line, which is divided, shows that the subject is astray, and there will be things that go wrong. And the end is basically a great defeat. And it says even in 10 years, the disaster will be so great that it can't be repaired. So there's a lot in there, but it ends with a bad turnout, basically. So you have to wonder why is if Mr. Barrett takes these things very literally, and of course there are people that do astrology, and they believe very strongly in what they believe, and I'm not going to say that they're wrong. I have no idea who's right or wrong. So long as people don't hurt me, I don't really care what their beliefs are. This gives a lot of freedom, but you can tell by the reading of it that it's a very negative ending. And if Mr. Barrett perhaps wanted these things to happen, he would have understood that, and perhaps may have actually initiated that. So a lot of people will point to this amazing, just wild occurrence of him kind of showing up and looking funny and just kind of weirding everybody out. But that may have been his intent the whole time, if you understand the background of this just by understanding context. Hard to say if that's what's going on in his mind, but does certainly seem possible. So let's read some of the footnotes here. They mentioned the foo is basically centered on the idea of returning and coming back over and over again. So going and coming back over and over again. What that all could represent, we mentioned already the cycle of 7, which could be 7 years. It could also be the idea of him coming back to perhaps someone that he really cared about, or back home. It's hard to say exactly what he's talking about. The last of the line shows inferior prevailing over superior men, and there are people that believe that Mr. Barrett was the most musically inclined member of the band. So in that way, I suppose, everything that's good in nature and society yielding before what's bad. Okay. And then when recovery or when decay is at its highest point, then recovery can happen. And it goes into a whole bunch more. But those are kind of the basic ideas of it. And each one of those lines, I guess, has something to do with, as you want to read it, they do kind of discuss the idea of the period of time. The seventh figure begins with the idea of the point of their return being 7 days. Explained, therefore, we have to take a day for a month. So right there, they're already kind of exercising some flexibility with the idea of what is meant by a day could actually be a month. But I will submit to you that period of time is completely subjective to whoever is trying to understand this, so it could be a year. That's pretty much it for the I Ching. And we know, of course, that Mr. Barrett was interested in those things, and I'd just like to point out again that the idea of Lucifer Sam, the Siam cat, could, of course, be a representation of himself being this person that is influenced by Eastern philosophies, and I guess I wouldn't call the I Ching a religion. It's more of a kind of a philosophy, I would say. So, what exactly is Mr. Barrett trying to achieve with this flexibility? If he's trying to achieve it, of course, it could just be a song that's, about some random hexagram from the I Ching. If you really want to believe that, you can. I'm not going to say you're wrong. I think you'd be wrong if you assume that, but it is possible. So it does appear that he's looking for freedom of some kind. And as a final contextual element for this episode, I would like to discuss an old book, a very old book, entitled How to Be Free, which is an ancient guide to the Stoic life, written by Epictetus, or I believe that's how you pronounce his name, Epictetus. Epictetus? I don't know. Anyway, now, this individual, I believe, was a slave at one point in time who became a bit of a Stoic kind of a philosopher or visionary, and put together the ideas of what are the things that you can control in your life and what are the things that you can't control in your life, and how can you be free in your life if you're constantly allowing outside factors to influence you or influence your mind, influence your existence, and of course by allowing things to influence your thoughts, you're allowing them to influence your mind. So this book, if you are interested in the philosophies of mental freedom, is it's kind of revelatory, in my opinion. So if you are interested in the ideas of being free, and I'll submit that quite a few of the beat poets and other people of that time, of the 60s, were quite interested in the idea of how to be free, kind of is what it's all about, really, so that you can pursue what your life is really about, and that what your life is really about is something that is supposed to be determined by you, not by other people and not by society at large. That's something that you're supposed to determine on your own. So, I guess, basically, I'll give you a few notes from this. This is basically a bunch of translations from the Enchiridion, and also some of the surviving books of the Discourses. And it has to do basically with the idea of freeing yourself of fear, anxiety, envy, anger, resentment, and grief, which of course are tied to everyone's life, but they are all generally kind of directed by the things that happen to you in your life, and whether or not you're able to understand them and exist in concert with your own experience. And if so, then perhaps you can attain a level of freedom. So here's a quote. A master is anyone who has the power to implement or prevent the things that we want or don't want. Whoever wants to be free, therefore, should wish for nothing or avoid nothing that is up to other people. Failing that, one is bound to be a slave. That's from the Enchiridion 14. So he goes through quite a bit here as a Stoic teacher and discusses how to live in harmony with nature, with society, and with your life. It is in many ways, in my mind, quite Buddhist, which is funny because we often think of the Buddhist philosophy as being something that is from the East, that is an Asian philosophy. But here is, of course, a Greek that is writing about Buddhist principles thousands of years ago. So here's a few things. The idea that there are things in the world that are up to you, while there are others that are not. And what is your own doing? And there are some interesting ideas, like the idea that your body is not really yours. In other words, you can't make your body do what you want it to do. Your body is going to do what it wants to do. So for some people, unfortunately, they have to deal with problems like cancer or sickness, and it can be very frustrating for those people to believe that perhaps their body should be doing what they think their body should be doing, but quite often that is not a choice, and someone has to deal then with the idea that their body is going to a large degree, do what it's going to do. And that can cause a lot of frustration and trouble. So, the idea that people that perhaps have money and get in your way and stop you from attaining the goals that you think that you should be able to do is very frustrating, of course, is something that perhaps can block your happiness in life. And if you are unable to make an accurate assessment of whether something is up to you or not, then if you're not able to perform that accurate assessment, then it's going to be very difficult, not only for you to be happy overall, but also to know the things to spend your energy on. Because if it's something that you can actually affect, then it's a worthy investment. So, just as an example, we mentioned getting sick. So, a lot of people have heart disease. I believe that's the #1 killer in the U.S. every year. So, if people just perhaps exercise more and ate a little bit more healthy, I'm sure a lot of people would still die of heart disease, but that number could change significantly. So, that's something that perhaps we could change simply by exercising more and eating better. But a lot of people don't put their energy in that direction. And of course, in doing that, you're doing that without knowing that you're actually changing your possible future. But you may be. And you have to be content with the idea that you may be extending your life, or you may be delaying that for 5 years, and you may still have to deal with the same problem. But if you do take that course of action, you can do it in a way that brings some form of happiness or satisfaction to your life, and that you are actually controlling the things that you can control. There are a lot of philosophical things that he discusses. I'll just bring up the idea of death. We've discussed the philosophical nature of death. The idea that fear of death can be a crippling thing in a person's life. It can steal away all the happiness of their life because they spend every day fearing the idea of death. So I'll just read a quick excerpt here. The terrible thing is the opinion that death is terrible. So whenever we are frustrated or troubled or pained, let us never hold anyone responsible except ourselves, meaning our own opinions. Uneducated people blame others when they are doing badly. And if you kind of understand the nature of things, then you will often blame yourself. But if you are a fully educated person, by educated he apparently means a wise person, you'll understand that there's no one really to blame. If someone's child or wife dies, it's normal to say that's just life. Yet whenever it's one's own family member who dies, the immediate response is, poor me, and this is a terrible thing. So the idea that perhaps death is something that's unavoidable and is part of a process, and that's not something that we can totally control, is something I think that a lot of people, it would favor a lot of people to revisit that idea, because in acceptance of that, there's freedom to some degree, that it is inevitable, and it does come. Then it does come every day. So, one last idea, real quick, is he mentions the idea that if you're big on philosophy or living a philosophical life to some degree, you have to be ready to be laughed at and mocked by other people. Like, oh, you're such a big philosopher, etc., etc. And I think in that degree, the idea that people are going to laugh at you and mock you, which we do know is something that is mentioned in Syd's letters. The idea of people laughing at him and mocking him as he was singing, etc., with the band. It can kind of hold some people back, but you have to be able to overcome that. And finally, don't let yourself be worried by thinking that your life is going to be without honor, and you will be a nobody, or a person that doesn't matter. I would like to point out that it is possible that perhaps this search for a philosophical life, a deep life, a life that's full of art and control of the things that you can control, will cause you to step away to some degree. As mentioned here in Epictetus, however you want to say it, it's also quite freeing. It's perhaps in many ways a more desirable situation to be in than to be constantly trying to make everyone else happy at the expense of yourself. Trying to seek honor with people that perhaps don't even really care about you to some degree. And he mentions, of course, the idea that you won't be invited to a banquet or a big dinner party. And that's something that a lot of artists have discussed, the idea of going to this big party. Of course, there are a lot of religions that kind of quote the idea of being in heaven as going to this great banquet in the sky or something like that. But the idea that perhaps you won't be part of that big party, and perhaps it's better not to be. And finally, the idea of money and being rich, and whether or not that is something that is innately good or not. He asked the somewhat rhetorical question, what would you rather have, money or a trustworthy and honorable friend? There are quite a few people, of course, Mr. Cobain comes to mind, who attained quite a bit and at some point in time seemed to realize that they were pretty much alone because they didn't have or hadn't made wise decisions about what is a true and honorable friend, what are the things that really matter to them, and perhaps they were trying to fill the voids in their life with some of the I won't say vices, but the illusions that are called out by Epictetus in How to Be Free. So if these topics are interesting to you, I will suggest this book. It's a little bit repetitive, I think. And if you are familiar with the Eastern philosophies of Buddhism or Taoism or any of those, then it'll be a little bit repetitive. But I do think it's worth reading, and I think it's pretty good. And I wouldn't be surprised if Mr. Barrett read that book as well. So that's pretty much it for chapter 24. Next song that we'll review will be Bike. And that is the last album off the Piper at the Gates of Dawn. It's a very important song as for certain reasons, but I think if you understand the full background of chapter 24, and if you are concerned, as I was, perhaps, with the nature of what happened with Mr. Barrett, I would like to point out that, as you can see through kind of breaking down this song, that this may be something that was an attempt, or perhaps even a successful attempt by Mr. Barrett to create a form of distance between himself and other people that allows him to kind of continue to contribute in some way. Perhaps it didn't work out. Perhaps it did. But it certainly does appear that it's in his mind. And so he was working through this, and perhaps it was of his own creation, and it was a way for him to find peace, the most peace he could find in the situation that he had. So there is, as we mentioned before, the pop history story of Mr. Barrett just being kind of pushed out of the band. But I would like to point out that as I reviewed these things, including this particular song, I do have quite a few suspicions about that now. And perhaps Mr. Barrett just wanted to go do his own thing, go be on his own. It is difficult to write, create art when there's people always around that are bothering you. So perhaps that was something that was more important to him, and this is a way that he could find to make kind of a deal to accomplish 2 things at once, or 3 things at once, or even 4 things at once. Who knows? So that's it for chapter 24. I'll try and do Bike pretty soon. Hope you enjoyed the episode. If you haven't, subscribed or to the series, please consider doing so. Give it a like if you can. That helps out with the ratings, and perhaps throws up the videos on other people's suggested videos on YouTube, so we can kind of discuss these on a larger scale with other folks as well. That's all for today. Thank you.